psychiatry in all of this time doesn't have one case report of one disease validated, not one. What they do is they meet at the American Psychiatric Association. They meet in the DSM committee, Diagnostic Statistical Manual Committee, and they vote on making new behavioral and emotional disorders, and they vote, and then they start immediately calling them diseases. And they tell people, they tell the public these are diseases. Total fraud. Total fraud.
When I worked for the drug industry, science was completely abandoned. These drug companies that I was interviewing with had no problem telling me, look, we design drugs based on treating symptoms. We don't cure. So that's a business model, okay, that allows you to give a drug to a person for life. They ran out of symptoms to treat. So what did they have to do? The next level of drug advertising is inventing disease. When you run out of symptoms, you don't have any more clientele to market to. So you have to invent disease. And with psychiatric medications, you can invent diseases all day long. I wondered, as a chemist, I'm making these drugs, they're proving deadly in our labs, and they're proving deadly in other labs, dangerous, ineffective, causing the exact same thing they're supposed to treat. How are they selling them? How are they selling them? And they have the marketing department. Big Pharma has the best marketing department in the world. Geniuses. You simply pay professionals, doctors, professors, psychiatrists, to report that the study showed positive results. You're paying them. You're buying science, checkbook science. Hypnotize the masses. Hypnotize them and drug them and get them into their psychiatrist so they can swallow the next Cymbalta or the next Prozac or whatever they're going to package it as and name it as. You have a billion-dollar industry making a lot of people sick and profiting on it.
Don't go to your psychiatrist. They get offended because they have feet of sand. They're selling a false product. So they get very angry as a group. I mean, there are always exceptions, but as a group, they get angry. They might even lock you up for wanting to come off your psychiatric drugs.
Psychiatry has not only misled the general public, but psychiatry in general and the pharmaceutical industry has misled the media, the politicians, legislation. When you have billions of dollars at your disposal, it grants you access to all of them to give false and misleading information. And the problem is that these people are not trained or equipped to ask the tough questions of asking for proof, of evidence about their false and misleading claims, that mental suffering is somehow a biological disease. In psychiatry and psychology, there are no medical tests, no scans, no blood work that can diagnose anybody with a mental disorder. When they come up with a diagnosis, they literally do it by a show of hands, based on a vote. That is totally unlike any true medical illness where people have true physiological tissue damage or there's an actual test to verify whether somebody has a medical condition or that they don't. If you have diabetes, you have it in every country around the world. If you have cancer, they can take it out of you and hold it and feel it. When you have ADHD, you can't hold it, you can't touch it, you can't see it. There's no way to medically verify it. It is a socio-cultural phenomena. If we like it or we don't like it, we can either label it or not label it. That is not a true medical condition. Definitely not a brain disease.
You've undoubtedly been told you're mentally ill for daring to say that the emperor called psychiatry has no clothes, not to mention stupid and unscientific. At least this is what some of my colleagues say about me at one university. So if this is something that has happened to you, I'm here to say that you're not alone. The controversy regarding the myth of mental illness and psychiatry is not about science or medicine, it's about power. What do we know that is true, that the cult of psychiatry keeps telling us is false? First, the idea that there is a known brain lesion causing mental illness. The truth is, we cannot tell who is mentally ill and who is not by looking at pictures of their brains or analyzing their blood. Psychiatrists had to invent their own book of diseases because pathologists would have nothing to do with them. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, the DSM, a great work of fiction. What's the difference? What's the difference between the DSM and a scientific book of disease? Every disorder in the DSM is invented. Every disease listed in a pathology textbook is discovered. Real disease is found in a cadaver at autopsy. Mental illness is not. Mental illness refers to something that a person does. Real disease refers to something that a person has. Consider this yet another way. It takes one person to have a real disease. It takes two people to have a mental illness. You cannot develop a mental illness such as hyperactivity or schizophrenia. This is because mental illness is always diagnosed on the basis of some sort of social conflict. When people do something that others find objectionable, they can be diagnosed as mentally ill.
You are being
watched.
The government has a secret system.
A machine that spies on you every hour of every day.
Hundreds of people in the valley say they are hearing voices in their heads. And those voices are being transmitted by microwave or other methods.
Well, several viewers asked us to investigate what they call electronic harassment. KMIR 6's Angela Monroe joins us now with what she's discovered. Angela.
Electronic harassment, synthetic telepathy, voice-to-skull technology. Chances are you haven't heard of these terms, but after searching the internet, I found dozens of websites dedicated to the phenomenon and several Valley residents who say they're victims.
How much more can you invade me than to go into my brain? It sounds
a very disturbing high-pitched noise, but there might even be voices or a message, a continual message that people have been victimized by, this sound there's this.
The night of my event, March 17th, 2017, I was standing at the kitchen window. I was washing dishes. And in the midst of washing the dish, all of a sudden, I felt like I was being struck with something. And it was an overwhelming sense of anxiety, pressure, completely inexplicable, and then pain that I have never felt before in my life. All of a sudden, I heard what one of the security officers had said to someone else just a couple of days before. Look, we don't know what's happening, but if you think something's happening, get off the X. And I heard that in my head, get off the X. And it was almost like I had been unplugged and a spell was lifted, and I moved.
In 2015, I began to experience what some call V2K, or voice to skull. This involves the projection of voices, noises, and music directly into my mind to communicate with me in real time and at the speed of thought. And it also includes the manipulation of thoughts, emotions, and perceptions in the person's mind. Additionally, the targeting is all highly perverted and sexual, as well as destructive and violent. Recently, they even started adding moaning and groaning sounds to the V2K and started putting actual creaking sounds directly in the walls to make it sound as though people are having sex. And I was able to audio record these rhythmic creaking sounds and have submitted this file to the commission. These voices are vulgar, violent, cruel, and constantly threatening and using profanities that I never use. They repeat certain phrases excessively, as I learned that repetition is a form of torture in and of itself. They frequently threaten to give me cancer, a stroke, or other medical emergency. They threaten to hurt my family. They threaten to make me lose all my money. They frequently threaten to do more extreme torture, etc. The voices also frequently tell me to commit suicide, something that is simply out of the question for me. Just the threatening alone is done at extreme levels and is its own form of torture. They coordinate the voices and thought manipulation with the physical torture, so that everything is highly synchronized in real time. They can see everything in my environment before I can, and if something is hidden out of my sight, they can tell me where it is, if they want me to see it. Likewise, they can also make me not see something that is right in front of my face. At first, I thought they were real humans because of how they related to me in real time, just like a human would. But then I realized I was communicating with a very highly advanced form of artificial intelligence that is able to respond and interact faster than the speed of thought to every single thought in my mind, while synchronizing the torture in my body at the same time. The timing of it all, along with the complexity of it all, seems like more than what a human would be capable of doing on their own. I began attending nightly support conference calls with other victims of electronic assault. I quickly saw the patterns in the way many people are targeted, including myself.
What we've been doing recently is generating words as magnetic patterns. And even though the person isn't hearing it through their ears, their brain is interpreting it. So they're actually having fragments of experiences as if they're hearing it, when in actual fact they cannot be.
You know, where are these thoughts coming from?
Dr. Persinger published the paper On the Possibility of Directly Accessing Every Human Brain by Electromagnetic Induction of Fundamental Algorithms, 1995. Quote, a process which is coupled to the narrow band of brain temperature could allow all normal human brains to be affected by a subharmonic whose frequency range at 10 Hz would vary only by 0.1 Hz. Random variations of noise within the matrices could potentially differentiate between individual brains. In other words, individuals could be identified by the specific characteristics of their brain output. He goes on further. Identification of these sequences could also allow direct access to the most complex neurocognitive processes associated with the self, human consciousness, and the aggregate of experimental representations, in other words, episodic memory, that define the individual within the brain.
So, Len, when you went to West Virginia and you went to this place that had no connection to any cell towers, there was no phone signal anywhere, and you had this attack, what specifically happened to you? Like, what can you walk me through how these attacks, like how they affect you, what happens, how long they last, etc.?
Just like I said before, it starts very suddenly. It's vibration. It's high pressure in the head, and your whole body vibrates. Deafening sound. You get disoriented.
Your whole body
vibrates.
Can you describe the sound that you hear? Is it like someone in the cartoons hitting a pot around your head?
It's like high pitch electronic tinnitus.
Okay. Yeah,
like tinnitus.
Yeah, tinnitus.
But suddenly on, suddenly off.
Suddenly on, suddenly off. Yeah. And it just grabs you, and you also hear voices. Yeah. The voices, V2K is a part of it. In Havana syndrome, I sent you that clip. The very first reporting by CNN, they said that people hear noises and voices. Mm-hmm. And after that, there was it was not part of any reporting. But the very first report on CNN contained that information. So, people think that hearing voices is a sign of psychiatric disorder, right. But it just takes a little bit of education to understand this Frey effect, this microwave hearing has been around for a long time, has been known, and voice modulation has been demonstrated in the 70s. There's published literature about it, that you can modulate the signal and it produces
And what specific voices? Like what do the voices say?
All the derogatory stuff that I don't want to acknowledge it, don't want to give it credence, but it's my family.
Your family's
my
voice.
family. They live in Germany. They speak Russian and German. I speak Russian, bad Russian now, and English. So all my V2K is in Russian. It is, yes.
It's multilingual.
It's my mother, my father, my brother, and his wife. And they all talk about my lifestyle choices, everything derogatory. And I know it's not them, it's artificial intelligence, because nobody talks 24/7, because my V2K is 24/7. I sleep in noise canceling headphones, and I play voice audiobooks nonstop, so my brain would concentrate on that rather than on what's being projected into my brain.
Does it help at all? What helps? What helps you cope with this the most? What have you done? What have you tried?
Distracting. Sometimes I have to use my own voice. I have to talk to somebody. The second it stops, the second the silence begins, the voices come back. And they also use something like, if you have some kind of white noise, like a fan or a AC, it rides on it. It piggybacks on those frequencies.
My first client, who then was an NSA, National Security Agency employee, had been impacted by what we believe to have been microwaves in 1996.
They're probably in here. Where this alleged incident happened is classified. The circumstances to why he was there is classified. NSA wouldn't tell me what any of that information was. So how am I supposed to help file this workman's compensation claim when all of the information is classified? In October of 2014, NSA finally gives me a document. The National Security Agency confirms that there is intelligence information from 2012, 4 years before Havana, associating the hostile country to which Mr. Beck traveled in the late 1990s with a high-powered microwave system weapon that may have the ability to weaken, intimidate, or kill an enemy over time and without leaving evidence. The 2012 intelligence information indicated that this weapon is designed to bathe a target's living quarters in microwaves, causing numerous physical effects, including a damaged nervous system. And this is the document that the US government, the NSA, the CIA, and others need to respond to and say, what did you mean by this? And what are you doing about it?
I started with the vertigo and the tinnitus and that brain fog. I could actually feel my brain shutting down, like everything kind of went black. I'm standing and it's feeling as if I'm being pushed, like you're being smashed from the top of the head into the ground. That particular symptom, it was many months after I had come back to the States before I started feeling that one.
There I was, lying there. And really nothing much happened, slight drifty feelings, like I would expect. And then suddenly, I felt as though my whole body was getting stretched longer and longer and longer, and as though my left leg was being pulled right up the wall, as though it had sort of like stretched, you know? And then it went back again. And that was so sudden and so weird. I was like, wow, that's, really weird. And then it was as though somebody had got hold of my shoulders and was like pulling my shoulders as though it was pulling me up. So I simultaneously knew that I was still lying down on this thing and yet felt that I was sitting up. So fine, nothing happens for a bit. I'm just lying there, just drifty sort, feelings. A bit as though I might be on the verge of having an out-of-body experience, but it never really happened. That sort of a feeling. And then suddenly I was angry. Really bizarre. It was just, I was furiously, do you know how sometimes you get angry? You just really, so mad. That sort of feeling, suddenly, there wasn't anything to be angry about, you know, and then it was gone. And, you know, okay. And then suddenly I was really frightened in the same kind of, I don't know what I was frightened of, just this awful fear, like creepy, skin-crawling, horrible fear came over me and went away again. And these experiences were so powerful that the thought I was left with really was this. I knew I had this motorcycle helmet on. You know, I could say, oh, well, you know, this is because of the motorcycle helmet. But what if you had those experiences without a motorcycle helmet? But the second thing made me actually quite worried was, what if you could do this at a distance?
Structures. But the critical thing is, we can still do it with something else. There's more and more evidence that small, weak forces can influence brain activity and alter consciousness. And we're about ready to go into this environment. It's called the communication age. Right now you're being inundated with all kinds of communication patterns, which if they're pulsed just right, well, I'll show you what they can do. The effectiveness and consequences of electromagnetic interactions with cells are functions of the complexity of the temporal structure of the fields. Remember, the brain works by chemistry, but it also works on the other side of the coin by electromagnetic patterns, right? Brain waves. If you apply an appropriate temporal pattern, it's equivalent to the molecular structure of the compound. So, using the famous helmet studies that almost everybody knows, if you stimulate the patterns through the helmet, and here's an example of someone wearing the helmet, the Corin helmet, magnetic fields of various patterns being generated through the temporal lobe, because remember, the temporal lobe is ultimately the source to many of these powerful psychedelic experiences. You end up with these kinds of experiences. People will invariably say, I felt the presence of something or somebody. In other words, here's a way of producing the altered state without the side effects of the drugs. There were pleasant vibrations moving through my body. As I felt as if I left my body or was detached from my body. The experiences did not come from my own mind, they came from somewhere else, that they were intruded, and I felt as if I were somewhere else. The same sequence that's associated with the psychedelic type drugs. And finally, to give you one example before we end, here's an example of a 25-year-old male, both temporal lobes being stimulated. It takes about 15 minutes, 15-20 minutes, just like many drug effects, except you're stimulating, you're tickling the tail of the dragon without any kind of side effects. I felt as if there were a bright white light in front of me. So the person sitting in a chamber, blindfolded, weak magnetic fields, weaker than the ones from your hair dryer, very similar to the ones that you're exposed to when your face is in front of your computer screen, or when you have your Walkman on, or your MP3 player. Same kind of intensity, different information. Person says, I felt as if there was a bright light in front of me. I saw a black spot that became a kind of funnel, no tunnel, that I felt drawn into. I felt moving, like spinning forward through it. I began to feel the presence of people, but I could not see them. They were along my sides. They were colorless, gray-looking people. I know I was in the chamber, but it was very real. I suddenly felt intense fear and felt ice cold. You can imagine what it would be if the person was sitting perhaps somewhere else, a less secure setting. Why would you want to talk about history in a brain and behavior course? Because when you talk about modifying brain activity, when you talk about controlling 6 billion brains, it becomes a political issue. It's not just neuroanatomy anymore. It's not just neurofunction. It's not no longer neurochemistry. Most people don't realize this.
What you're proposing is actually that there may be measurable ways in which, without using a cell phone or Skype or something, that people's brains might actually be measurably connected over a long distance.
May I answer that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, the difference between a telephone or a Skype is that there's a medium in between. Either there's a wire or wireless, or there's electromagnetic field or whatever. In the case of non-locality and excess correlation, there's no obvious medium. There's no electromagnetic generation. I guess the best way to describe it is the experiment we did with Dr. Dunn and I did a few years ago. We have a photon reaction here and a photon reaction here. We inject a small amount of chemical to get a photon reaction. If, for example, we have these two vials in the same circular magnetic field, and there's technical reasons for doing that. It's got to be very specific. It's got to imitate effectively what the proton electron does. But if they're rotating the same way, what it does, for all practical purposes, is it juxtaposes the two separate spaces as if they were one space. So it's not like you're communicating across. What you're doing is you're superimposing the two spaces. How do we know that? Because when this occurred, it was equivalent. When these photon emissions occurred, if we injected simultaneously with these rotating fields, it was as if both were simultaneously superimposed, and so the photon emission doubled. And when we look at the brain that my young colleagues did last summer so effectively, if you look at the quantitative EEG work, it's almost as if the two brains, even though they were separated by thousands of kilometers, were superimposed transiently and were actually the same brain for a brief period of time.